Greg Chasson, PhD, ABPP, is the award-winning author of the new book Flawed, Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. He is an esteemed psychologist, board-certified cognitive behavioral therapist, researcher, educator, and international keynote speaker. He is an associate professor at the University of Chicago, where he specializes in the nature and treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder and related conditions, including perfectionism, high functioning autism spectrum conditions, and anxiety disorders. He has provided cognitive behavioral therapy for clinically severe perfectionism for nearly 20 years, which we're going to talk about today. And as an active scholar, Dr. Chasson has authored and co authored more than 70 scientific publications and one academic book, in addition to his new book, Flawed. Dr. Chasson, welcome to Prospecting on Purpose.
Thank you for having me. You made me sound awesome.
Yeah, I know. I was like, man, I'm reading some smart sounding words.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. I read your book and it's funny because I'm looking forward to getting into our conversation because there definitely were some themes that I thought perfectionism was, and I
Mhm.
was definitely wrong. And then it was just really fascinating. So I'm excited to get into it. But before we do, can you give a little background on just, your background outside of the bio that I mentioned, but also why you're focusing on perfectionism or how you found this subject matter?
Yeah, absolutely. Perfectionism is a part of the obsessive compulsive spectrum in a lot of ways. It's not just related to OCD, you see it in other things as well. But in my world, where I do a lot of work in OCD and related conditions, perfectionism is a very common presentation. And so I've been dealing with this for many, many years, and I now am the director of the OCD program at the University of Chicago. And you're probably not going to be surprised to learn that a lot of people who self-select to come to the University of Chicago, faculty, staff, students, they tend to be a little bit on the perfectionistic side,
Mhm.
and they end up coming to see me because they get overwhelmed. And I just kept saying the same thing over and over to them and providing the same treatment and the same intervention. And I just thought, one at a time, this is just not getting where it needs to go. So let's
Mm.
see if we could spread this message to more than just people in this community at the University of Chicago.
Oh, that's fascinating origin story. So the flawed book is the ability to really help scale and reach more people experiencing perfectionism. But also, I thought what was really interesting is your lens of perfectionism is on the workplace. So if
Yes.
you're a leader of people, if you're working for someone who maybe has these tendencies, I think that was the biggest takeaway I had is you gave a
Mhm.
lot of tools in the workplace application.
Yeah, and that's what I was hoping to do. So I appreciate you acknowledging that. I think about 60% of the book offers solutions and strategies that you can apply in an everyday way from the top down in the culture kind of way to the culture of the workplace, from the bottom up, helping individual employees with perfectionism as a manager. But I really did kind of focus on leadership and management because there are some self help books on perfectionism. There are books out there that just give a general overview of what perfectionism is. They all do a fabulous job, but I feel like you walk away without any tools or skills, and none of them, in my opinion, really narrow in on the management, leadership, business, where I think a lot of the downfalls of perfectionism really play out
In the workplace, yeah, because
in the
this is
workplace. Yeah,
where we make our money and spend most of our time. So
right.
before let's orient the audience. Can you give us a definition of perfectionism?
Yeah, sure. It'll be imperfect, but I'll give you a perfect.
That's okay. We're allowed to be imperfect on this show.
Yeah. So perfectionism really is a disposition, a personality feature, so to speak. And it really is, I think there are two main characteristics. The first is cognitive rigidity, the idea that people have a hard time shifting mindsets, pivoting to new strategies and tactics, getting sort of stuck in a one-track mind, despite data and evidence being right before them that suggests the opposite. It really is sort of like the Titanic, unable to shift before it hits the iceberg. So that's sort of a cognitive rigidity component that I think is crucial for understanding perfectionism. And the other is just excessive expectations,
Mm.
right? The idea that the goals and the standards that they've put forth for themselves or other people are beyond what is standard, typical, or truly expected at a normative level. And so it's really the combination of those two things, the rigidity plus the excessive expectations, that I think creates a pretty toxic combination where you have people who are pursuing things that are infeasible and then they're doing so in a way where they're unwilling to deviate from that.
Okay. So then can you share a couple of examples of maybe how that shows up in a workplace environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it shows up a lot of places, but some of the common examples might be if someone is working on a project and they feel like they can't get it just right, which is something I talk about in Flawed, this just right feeling. We call it NJRFs or NJREs. And I think we all get this to some degree, but it's really a matter of how much it gets in the way and causes impairment and distress. And so if somebody's working on an email over and over and over again, trying to get it to sound just right, or they have people check it over and over and over again, or they're seeking a ton of reassurance, those kinds of behaviors can get in the way of not just interpersonal dynamics of the team, but it could slow you down. Productivity grinds to a halt. And here's where the irony comes in. Sometimes it actually undermines the quality of the product because you're so focused on the details that you miss the entire purpose or the principle of it in the first place. So I really think the productivity angle is probably the biggest area where it causes difficulty. I also think that the interpersonal dynamics of the workplace also get dramatically impacted by this as well.
Right. If you have a coworker who can't send a simple email because they need you to look it
Right.
over, or hey,
Right.
can I read this email to you
Right.
before I send it? That's okay sometimes, but
Yep.
that would drive me crazy. That would drive me nuts.
It does. And the person that's experiencing it, they're feeling extremely anxious and they understand that it's a burden on other people, but they almost feel like they can't help it.
Right. And even my language, just there saying that would drive me crazy. I apologize for that. I know that I'm trying to be
Mhm.
more aware of my words, but I feel like one of the things that I could definitely see throughout the book is that it's almost like there's this big irony. Like they want it so hard to be perfect that the work doesn't even happen. So it's like
Right.
you missed your project deadline because you didn't get the work done because you're waiting for it to
Yeah.
be perfect. But then obviously it's not perfect if it doesn't get done. So I talk a little bit about like that kind of
Yeah.
fulfilling prophecy cycle that you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is a type of situational irony. And I call OCD itself the irony disease because
Mm,
people, every almost every form of OCD, it's really ironic, though somebody that comes in and is obsessed about contamination and getting sick, they'll wash their hands so much that it creates these cracks
mm,
and wounds where they're more likely to actually get infected.
right.
Right? So it's just situational irony. Well, perfectionism is very similar to that. Somebody will sit there and get stuck in process paralysis where they'll try to find the optimal strategy or steps. And they'll write lists and more lists. And my favorite are lists about lists, right? Just like tons of lists. And by doing so, they might not actually get to the things on the list. So the example I use in the book, to include some spoilers,
Yeah.
is that somebody might create a grocery list and be so obsessed about it and become so perfectionistic that they don't even get to the grocery store on time.
Right. So they missed the
And
window.
that is irony, right? You're trying to create the perfect shopping list to do a perfect shopping and you don't even shop.
And that's I think one of the things like you had a lot of really good examples. And actually there's like two kind of really funny parts in the book that I'm not gonna spoil for the audience, but I feel like you probably know what they are. One was about, you misspelled a word. Now I'm spoiling it, but like you misspelled a word and then you're like, you didn't even notice I misspelled this because your brain filled this in.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like an aha. Like I had quite a
Right.
few ahas. One thing I was thinking about asking you, and you already talked about this reassurance seeking.
Yep.
That part of the book, I did kind of see a little bit in myself,
Yep.
but maybe more along the lines, and I don't know if this is just like me being narcissistic or something, but sometimes I'll write a really good email and then I'll go back and just reread it like 6 times. Is that weird?
No, that's not weird. I think that shows a little bit of strength of some self-esteem, like you feel like you did a nice job and it feels good to go back and look at something you've done well. Now a perfectionist probably won't ever get to that feeling, right?
Oh, okay. Because okay,
So
I also seek compliments quite a bit too, Greg. So I don't know if that's reassurance seeking or just like fishing for compliments. But those are kind of the areas where I kind of saw myself in the book. And you
yeah.
you talked a little bit about like a perfectionism scale. So how can people start to kind of see outside of the two things, the cognitive rigidity and excessive expectations? Like, what are some other clues like from a tangible application that people can start to see in the workplace, whether it's from themselves, their teams, or their colleagues?
Yeah, so we all fall somewhere on this scale. It's like height or income or age. Everyone's got it, right? Everyone's got a height, everyone's got an age. And I think everyone falls somewhere on this scale. Some people are extremely high on it. So their cognitive rigidity, their excessive expectations, all the behaviors that come with perfectionism really are strong characteristic for those individuals. Then you've got people who are in the middle, the Goldilocks zone. That's where a lot of us fall. And then there are people who are on the other extreme, and I don't really talk much about them in the book. And I think they're a lot less research, but I imagine that sometimes that extreme can be equally problematic. Someone who's so flexible that they can't even, land on a single plan, and they're sort of, waffling between things constantly. I think that's a lot less discussed, and there's a lot less research on it. But most people fall somewhere on here, and the book is really about those, like, the cases where it's getting in the way at work. It
Mhm,
doesn't even include the extreme cases. Those are the ones I see in my clinic. They have a hard time even keeping a job, let
mhm.
alone disrupting a workplace. And so, really, the book is meant for that lane, where you have this perfectionism that's getting in the way, but not so extreme that it's debilitating where you can't even work. And we're not talking about the people that are on the half that are, they almost don't seem to care about, they just get things done, and they don't seem to really care about the quality.
So then if you are like a leader of people and you're starting to see some of these tendencies,
Yeah.
can you share like one of the things I was really surprised to read about was perfectionism and hoarding.
Uh-huh.
I
Yeah.
mean, that was like a pretty eye-opening connection to me. Can you give like a little bit more clarity and example as to why those two correlate?
Yeah, it's one of those things I love to tell people because it really is counterintuitive that
Mhm.
people with hoarding tend to be very perfectionistic, and that the perfectionism often is a result of or drives a lot of the hoarding behavior. And so what happens is that people with hoarding tend to accumulate things because they're trying to create the perfect vision of what they want their space to look like. They want perfect systems and organizational schemes. They have perfect projects and visions of things they want to do, crafts and things like that. And what happens is that they end up not being able to meet those expectations, or they never get around to doing it because they end up procrastinating, which is a common component of perfectionism. And then the things just start to pile up. And so they have this house or office full of partially or non started projects and a whole, well of visions and hopes for what they would want this to look like. And you would see this in the workplace. So if somebody has an office full of clutter and just stuff everywhere and stacks of paper everywhere and books, and they're the kind of person that might even say, I know exactly where everything is. I
Mm.
could just reach into that pile and grab it right now. This is the kind of thing where you might see some overlap between perfectionism and hoarding in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the many examples of elements of surprise, because I think my perception of what perfectionism was kind of like in high school, the student who always raised their hand and they always had the answer and they were
Mhm.
valedictorian. Like I always thought perfectionism was kind of like the control freak land more
Right.
and the need to do everything perfect. But really, what I learned from the book is that it shows up in a lot of different ways that seem to be quite debilitating.
Yeah.
And so if you were a manager of someone who has a teammate who's, slowing the team down because they have to get a bunch of eyeballs on their emails, like, what are
Yeah.
some tactics that leaders can do if they have an employee experiencing perfectionism?
So I think it starts at 2 levels. I like to stop the problem before it even starts, so some
Mhm,
prevention, and the way to do that is to create a work culture that promotes anti-perfectionism or anti-perfectionism where, this is not creating an environment where the expectations are reasonable, creating a principle-based approach rather than a rule-based approach, which is something we could talk about, creating a situation where you're not broadcasting and using reward as a public shaming technique, which can be
mhm,
very difficult for people, can be incentivizing for some, and then can be completely paralyzing and demoralizing for others. So I
yeah.
think if you're going to use that kind of system, you just need to go in with eyes wide open, knowing that there's a cost to it as well. So creating systems that are anti-perfectionistic is a great idea. And it starts with also just the language and the culture that you've created from the outset of the job hiring process. If the employee handbook, employee, evaluation forms, training, orientation, all of these things can really hammer home an anti-perfectionistic message, I bet if I were to look at a lot of these materials for companies, a lot of it would be promoting perfectionism rather than the opposite, or at least being neutral. And so I think it starts with the prevention techniques. That's not going to stop it all from happening, but you could mitigate some of it just by doing that. And then if people come into the workplace and they have this level of perfectionism that gets in the way, that's where the book comes in and it gives different strategies for providing help to that individual, whether it be helping them with their task prioritization using exposure therapy techniques. You're not a therapist for most of us, or not therapist. I mean, I am, but most people are not therapists in the workplace. But you can still adopt some of the principles and use them in the workplace. And so I give some tips on that. I give some tips on how to catch when you're conflating rules and principles, and learning the difference between those and how that can get in the way. And I provide strategies for dealing with some cognitive flexibility. A lot of it is behaviorally based and cognitive based, and I think it's tailored to each individual. So I can't give you like a broad here, do this. I think it really needs to be configured to the individual.
Well, and I like the idea of creating a culture and a workplace where, like, the anti-perfectionism, I almost
Right.
feel like that could be something that is said in like an interview or a first day orientation, like that language even. And so let's
Right.
talk a little bit about, because this was something that was a pretty big light bulb for me in your book, was the difference between rules, principles, and values.
Yeah.
And what you just said is creating, principle based versus rule based. Can you
Yeah.
give definitions to those three and then an example, please?
Yeah, I'd be delighted. So rules are very concrete, measurable. You know whether they've been met or unmet. Principles are underlying those rules, and they are more abstract. You can't really tell if they've been met or unmet. It's almost always, it's almost always, you know, in question. You're always sort of questioning whether it's been met or not. And you really can just show degrees of fidelity towards them. How faithful are you to the principles, rather than this principle has been met, this principle has been not been met. That doesn't work that way. And
Mhm.
then underlying principles are values, which are even more abstract, more like single sort of compass directions that provide you with a very broad framework for how to approach life. And so you can see that they're built off of each other. And I show a pyramid figure in the book. Rules are at the very tippy top. In the middle, you have principles, and underneath that, you have the foundation, which is values. And I give an example in the book of, and it's funny, I was just talking to a client about this who got sent home for being 1 minute late to his shift.
No
1 minute.
way. No
And it's
way.
like, but different watches and clocks have like slightly, 1 minute. And so you get these people who are so rule driven and so rule bound that they miss the underlying principles and the underlying values that are driving those. So the rule in that case would be get to work at 7 p.m. or
Mhm.
7 a.m. The underlying principle underneath that is, you should probably be to places on time. And then the value underlying all that is punctuality,
Right. And
right?
so someone experiencing perfectionism would see the work starts at 7 a.m. If it's 7:01, you broke the rule, game over, versus,
Right.
okay, the principle is this person is generally on time. They're just
Right.
late this one day by 1 minute. Let's have some gray area or some wiggle room.
Right. Or let's say that it's actually the decision to over enforce the rule undermines the principle. So in the case, another example would be a rule is don't run in the pool area when it's wet.
Mhm.
I mean, makes sense, but what's the underlying principle? Well, the principle is, pools are dangerous, so be safe around pools, right?
Right.
And the value is just safety.
Right.
Now, if there's a kid drowning in the pool and the lifeguard's yelling at the mom for running to save her kid because she's violating the rule of not running, it doesn't make any sense because the entire point of that rule is for safety and the kid's drowning.
Right.
It's a really
That's
stupid example, but it really illustrates the difference between these.
No, I was gonna say that's fascinating because I think that because it's such a simplified example, it helps give a little bit more like clarity and maybe empathy to the people experiencing perfectionism too, because
Yeah,
I think that's seems so obvious, the example that you just said. But
right,
I feel like what's interesting about it is that it's not necessarily obvious to the person experiencing perfectionism. And I think maybe
right,
that's another aha that I had is it feels like perfectionism really is a mental health issue versus just like a quirk or this person likes to be in control. That's not really what perfectionism is. And I think that was one of the big ahas that I had reading the book.
Yeah, I don't think everyone with perfectionism has a mental health condition per se. I think we all fall somewhere on there, but I do think it can absolutely get in the way like a mental health
Right.
condition. And when it's really extreme, it is a mental health condition,
Right.
right? Like we all can get sad, but if it becomes really extreme with a couple other things, it's probably depression, right?
Right.
So I think in a lot of ways, it doesn't need to be a mental health condition, but I definitely think it needs to be on people's radar.
Right, especially as a leader of people, because I think that's where if you don't have any exposure to this, like I had never really learned about it until I read your book. If you're a leader of people, you have no exposure to this, you may be
Yeah.
mislabeling what's going on with your teammate. And I think this gives a
Yeah.
lot more like resources and tools and empathy on how to really help this individual who's going through
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, I mean, this is not just to I'm not saying this to gloat, maybe a little bit, but I'm not, there people who have read the book who have been in business for a long time, they said, "I wish I would have had this book 20 years ago,"
Yeah.
because they're like, "This reminds me of Joe back in, the 1980s when I was working at this so and so," and this person was like, "Oh my god, this totally explains Tim," and, like, I got so many of those comments, and I'm thinking, "We see this everywhere,
Yeah.
and I bet you read this book, it'll resonate with you, so you should go
Right.
buy it."
Yeah, yeah, buy the book, buy Flawed. Well, and it was I mean, you gave me a couple tools too, because there was one area where you're talking about like, I feel like I'm a pretty assertive person when I need to be, but that's more in like business settings. And then when it came to colleagues and coworkers and clients, it can be a little bit more difficult for me to be assertive,
Yeah.
but then the other options are really aggressive, passive aggressive, or passive. So it's like all of them are great, but I think you gave some clarity on if you can set clear boundaries, communicate in these certain ways, help these individuals by XYZ. Like that I think was a really like there's a lot of tactical, tangible takeaways from it that I thought were
Mhm.
very helpful. I would love to ask you because your example of this reminds me of Tim, this reminds me of Bill, whoever. What
Yeah.
do you do if you're an employee? Because I was reading this book and I had one former supervisor who nail on the head perfectionist, and I never put it together until I was reading the book and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's why I had to go
Mhm.
through this. That's why our team struggled here." Like, if you have a perfectionist boss and you're not in a
Yep.
leadership position, what are some tools that listeners can start to deploy that would help them in that type of environment?
Yeah, those are one of those situations where I think you have a limited amount of control for the most part. And so there are some things you can do, but in the end, you have to acknowledge how much control you actually have in that situation. One is I do think that practicing assertiveness is probably your best strategy.
Mhm.
Learning how to communicate in an effective way that doesn't cost you too much social capital as you're doing it, right? Most bosses don't like being called out in a public setting. Most don't like being called out incessantly. Most, prefer a more gentle and more infrequent approach. So I tell people, please do this in private when you talk to a boss who might be perfectionistic and is causing problems. The assertiveness component is really about trying to zoom out and make comments that are not necessarily going to put them on the defensive.
Mm,
It is more about how it's making you feel or making you struggle. You might say something like, I'm really concerned about the timeline that's been put forth for this project. I don't know that it's going to be able to be done by that timeline, instead of your deadlines are really unrealistic,
right. Or I
right?
have
One of
too
the
much on my plate. How am I supposed to manage these 19 tasks you just gave me? Pick which
right.
one's the most important.
Right. So I think, anything where you're saying you is
Yeah.
going to put people on the defensive. And I think anything that is more about you, I is going to be a more palatable for the person listening. That being said, you can't guarantee how they're going to respond. And some people don't respond well to assertiveness, especially if you've been non assertive in the past. So if all of a sudden you turn on a switch and you're assertive, they might see you as being particularly aggressive, which technically is probably not true, but it's the contrast that's so difficult. And I would practice, start small. I do it with the waiting staff at the restaurant, start with just practice your assertiveness. And you'll see that it is a way of preserving social relationships to the best that you can, but also maximizing that you can get what you want without destroying those relationships, but also some self-respect in preserving some of that, which is very difficult.
Yeah, I liked like the kind of the concept of how you communicate and like setting boundaries because I feel like what you've put throughout the book was really around helping with some like guardrails, for lack of a better word. And so, if you're
Mhm.
a person who's working for a perfectionist, or if you have a member who's experiencing perfectionism, here's different communication ways, boundaries, things you can do to help them work through that while
Right.
not reducing productivity.
Yeah, I think that's key because I don't want people to feel like working on this is going to sacrifice the quality of the work. And so I always maintain that high expectations are perfectly reasonable and can lead to some glorious things. But when the perfectionism elements of cognitive rigidity and excessive expectations get into the mix, causes all sorts of chaos and problems. And so shooting for high expectations is not the same thing as perfectionism. And by addressing perfectionism, it isn't going to undermine the quality. If anything, it's going to increase it, but it's also most definitely going to increase the efficiency or productivity.
Okay, I like that a lot because I think that also it's like you can still be in the driver's seat. You can still have control, but the control doesn't have to be so rigid because that's where people are getting stuck. Is that an accurate
Yeah.
summation?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the book is about control at its core, at its heart. And I really think that perfectionism is this tendency to overestimate control. The
Mm,
idea that there's more that they can control than they really can, which is funny because I think that's a form of anxiety. I think all anxiety is a misperception of having too much control when you
right,
really don't.
right,
You can't control these things that you think you can. Whereas
right,
I think depression's the opposite. I think people
right.
have more control than they really think they do. Right. And so finding that middle ground, that Goldilocks zone is really critical. But I think that it is about control, and I often tell people, it's often about using that control to give up that control. That
Mm,
really sometimes the best thing to do is to not let control take you rather than you taking control.
using that control to give up control.
Yeah.
That is some meta stuff we're getting into. I like
It's super meta. Feel like I need to stop eating gummies before coming on here.
no, but I was like, I don't live in California anymore. I'm in Utah now. So
Right, they don't sell
different.
gummies, do they?
No, but I think one of the things that I appreciate you saying that because I think that's where I could see a lot of different things stemming from in a lot of different areas is this feeling of control and the fact that it's a balancing act. And I think that's really where starting a business has been a good vehicle for me to really stretch myself because there's so many things that I wasn't ready for that have gone wrong, and you just have to learn how to kinda go with the flow more, and that has been something I'm still learning and I've had to learn, but
Yeah.
it's almost like using different opportunities as a vehicle for growth. So, if you're listening to this, listeners, and you're starting to feel like maybe there is some perfectionism in me, Greg's book is a great resource for you, but also I like the idea of kind of one of our action items is let go of control, in some ways and really
Yep.
be okay with the anti-perfectionism life that we're living here.
Yeah, if you could lean into the uncertainty and the unpredictability and sit with the discomfort of not having total control and understanding that any sense of control is often a fantasy,
Mm,
those ingredients, and the willingness to sit with that discomfort, that usually is that's the recipe for success. You look at most people that own a company like you or CEOs, they tend not to be very perfectionistic. It's very hard to be really perfectionistic and make your way to that level because to get to that level, you've got to be comfortable sitting with a lot of risk, a lot of discomfort. You've got to be very decisive and sit with the consequences of your decision. Things that are, in a lot of ways, the complete opposite of people with perfectionism who are constantly trying not to be in those positions. And so I tend to find a lot of perfectionism is more at the CFO, CTO kind of level, you
interesting.
know, and the middle management, but I don't really see a ton of it at the CEO level. I do see it, but it's not, I just get the sense it's less frequent because you talk to a lot of CEOs and they, in a lot of ways, they just can't even understand people that are perfectionistic.
That's kind of what I was like reading, I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, that would be so bogged down," like, and
Yeah.
I think that sometimes I feel like maybe I might be on too far on the spectrum, like you mentioned, like, I don't do research before, I'll just pick a plane seat, like, just get it done and
Yeah.
move on, and then sometimes like,
Yeah.
"Okay, I wish I had researched this hotel
Yeah.
before I'm staying in this sketchy neighborhood." So
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
some pros and cons to both.
That just happened to me in Los Angeles. I said I probably could have been a little
Uh-oh.
more perfectionistic about it.
What
Ended up
neighborhood did you stay in?
I was in a at a hotel that didn't have a bathroom in the hotel room, and it was in a sketchy part of Inglewood, and I'm like, probably should have researched this a little bit more.
We would have people come to stay, and the travel team is not based in Los Angeles, and so they'd pick a
Yeah.
hotel in a neighborhood where like a body was just found in the lake across the street from the Holiday Inn. It's like they
Right.
cannot stay there, but if you don't know, you don't know. So I feel like there's and let's maybe end on more of a positive note. What are some of the positive qualities of perfectionists that they bring to the workplace?
So many. I'm glad you asked that question. I always feel that I need to make sure that we comment on this because I always worry that people with perfectionism are gonna think that I don't want them to walk away thinking that not only are they a pain, but they're hope that there's no hope.
Oh yeah.
So they bring a ton to the table, and this is not a witch hunt. I don't want people with perfectionism to not, get hired, to get let go. People with perfectionism are often your strongest employees. They're honest a lot of the time, extremely loyal, sometimes to a fault, uh, and conscientious. If there's a single characteristic I would choose in an employee, I think that would be the one, is conscientious. They tend to be very detailed oriented, which for a lot of jobs is super critical,
Mhm.
right? To counterbalance people that don't have that, they can be absolutely critical. And so there are a lot of really good components of perfectionism. And I think the point of the book is really to reduce some of the damage that perfectionism can cause while allowing you to preserve or even amplify some of the positive qualities that come with it.
I think that was a beautiful way to wrap up. Reduce the damage that it can cause if you get too far down the runway, and then also amplify all of the positive qualities. Because some of the teammates that I can think of that have had perfectionism, you're exactly right. Like they're doing the jobs that I couldn't do because
Right.
my brain doesn't think that way either. So I think that
Right.
it's like in any organization, you have different strengths that you have to pull from to make a cohesive team. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that. I am so happy that I got to talk to the perfectionist guru. You're the man. I feel like I learned so much from the book, and I will
Thank
link
you.
everything in the show notes so people can buy it. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about you and your message and your book and your platform?
Yeah, thank you. You could go to see more about the book, you can go to flawedbook.com, which is a bit of an unfortunate URL, but flawedbook.com. Hopefully you'll remember it. And then if you want to learn more about me and other things that are going on, and also learn more about the book, you can go to gregchasson.com, GregChass as in Sam, O, N as in Nancy.com, and learn more there. You feel free to reach out to me. Happy to answer questions. And I have some, blog stuff going on. You can read some articles, things like that.
Yeah, Greg is a plethora of information. So I'm so happy that we were able to have him on the show. Thank you so much for joining Prospecting on Purpose.
Thank you for having me.